Okay, folks, here we go. So a photograph of the Earth taken from the back of the moon. The brown thing there is the moon. This is about 1969, and it's an image of the Earth rising. The Latin phrase "sic vos non vobis" is a long time frame for us, and it means yes, for you, but not yours, encouraging us to take better care. Our story starts here with carbon. There are three numbers for the carbon story. The first number is 2 degrees Celsius, which is the Paris Treaty limit. We can't let the temperature of the atmosphere go above 2 degrees C from 1880. Right now, it's very close to 1.5, and we're in difficulty. The second number is 565 gigatons of carbon. That's basically the budget to keep us from getting above 2 degrees Celsius, or the Paris limit. So those are the two numbers to start with, a 2 and a 565. The third number is the frightening number. This is 2,795 gigatons of carbon. That's how much carbon the fossil fuel industry has in reserve on their books, so to speak, and in the ground where they have located it. Disturbing because that's 5 times the budget that we're allowed to spend to keep us under 2 degrees Celsius. So there's a danger there that the fossil fuel industry owns the assets. They want to sell them to us and have us burn them, which will really put us in difficulty. So that's our predicament in raw numbers. The temperatures on this little thermometer are used from a couple of years ago to show people what's happening. The green line is the 1.5. That's the lowest rate that we want the temperature to go up. If we can keep it at 1.5, we'll be safe for at least the time being. When the UN had the climate conferences and they sent all the countries home to say, go home to your country, figure out a plan to keep your country under 1.5, and then come back and we'll check your homework. And that's what happened. So the countries went home, they did all their work, they made a plan, the local national plan, and they came back and handed in their homework, and the UN checked it and said, okay, if everybody does what they promised, we'll still be at 3.3 degrees, which is way too much. And then if we don't do anything, just leave everything alone, business as usual, the yellow line, we're going to go to 4.2 degrees Celsius above our guidelines. So that's the challenge. Even when we promise to do things, it's not enough. We have to do better. The fossil fuel consumption around the world is going up. These slides will be available later, so you can click on that data point. It's from the World in Data, and it's very sobering, but at least you know I can get the information. This is good information. The temperature increase in this chart, going back to 1880 in the left-hand corner, you see the blue-green lines. That's when things were pretty quiet. Suddenly, around 1940, you can see them starting to go above the line. That's the temperature of zero increase. They get worse and worse. We go to 1980, they really jump. And then you can see COP1, the first conference of the parties, saying we better take a look at this. That was in 1992, I believe. And then further along, we're already 26 years later, COP26 in Glasgow, and notice that the red is still going up and up. So we have a tremendous problem that we seem unable to address. When the temperature goes up, bad things happen around the world because the climate has changed. These are photographs of Pakistan from 2 years ago. 90% of the crops in Pakistan were wiped out. 33 million people were displaced. This was a horrendous moment, but of course, for many of us, it was far away, and we didn't notice it. That little poignant photograph of those little kids on that raft, getting rescued. The raft, by the way, is a satellite TV antenna. The drought leads to deadly fires. This is a picture of a burning redwood tree. They're not supposed to burn, but that's how bad it was. It got that hot. The ocean heat has been going up. This is a graph that measures recent increases in ocean temperature. The blue line in the middle is the average from say 1990 to 2020. So it's about 30-year average. That's where it is, right smack in the middle of the ocean surface heat. But you'll see at the top in the white line, that's last year, as of August 15th, a tremendous jump in ocean sea surface temperature. This is Fahrenheit. It went from an average of about 68.5 to 69.5, and it's now approaching 70 degrees ocean temperature worldwide. This is not a good thing because we know that warmer water is a really good nursery for very, very powerful storms. This is a photograph of Hurricane Katrina, 2005. Almost 2,000 people died in USA. $108 billion of damage, and the winds reached up to 173 miles per hour. Sometimes we get scared by the wrong things. This is a poster from Shark Week, which is an American phenomenon in television. We get this every summer. Horrendously large creature, the shark, coming after this poor woman. This is hyping people to watch the show. However, in terms of shark attacks on human beings, it's a very minimal number, maybe 6 times a year or 7 times a year, something like that happens. However, what the real issue is, if you go to climate change, is this guy right here. A warming planet increases the spread of mosquito-borne disease. I don't have to tell people from the African continent about that, between malaria and dengue and other diseases. Mosquitoes and the diseases they carry kill more people in one day than sharks kill in 100 years. So we're maybe sometimes looking at the wrong threat. We need to pay attention, but that's basically an outcome of climate change and the warming atmosphere. We know, too, that a lot of species are suffering because of the increase in temperatures and the changing habitats. This is a picture of a Philippine eagle. 3/4 of Earth's species are at risk. And even conservative estimates suggest that this extinction rate, based on vertebrate data, that's animals with the vertebrate, it's about 100 times higher than it would be without humans being around. We also know that we're taking stuff out of the ground and setting it on fire, which is the standard procedure for fossil fuels. This is a coal mining operation in Germany at the time. About 10 years ago, that was the largest machine on the planet that could move on its own power. And you can see the amount of devastation that's accompanying that. We also know deforestation is part of our problem. It's a picture of Brazil as the rainforest is chopped down as it gets encroached upon. We know also that the warming temperatures have melted a lot of ice sheets. There's a picture of Greenland, a massive ice sheet up there. It's weakening and melting. As it goes into the ocean, it raises the sea level. The water on land, the frozen water on land, ice on Greenland and Antarctica, when it goes off the land and goes into the ocean, it raises the sea level. Also, because the sea level is getting warmed up by the sun because of the atmospheric changes, warm water takes up more space. As simple physics, warm water increases the distance between the molecules, so that increases the sea level rise. And in some parts of the world, this is going to make a difference in terms of basically life and death. The archipelago of Tuvalu in the photograph in the South Pacific has an average elevation of just 2 meters. You can see what that looks like. It's just a sliver of sand and some palm trees. It's seeing the impacts of rising seas already. So that's a good example of a sad story. This is a different country. This is a map of Vietnam. You can see the South China Sea there on the left-hand side and Vietnam just above it. And that's a projection of sea level problems going forward. This is a satellite image. They're predicting by 2050 they'll have high tides once a year that will cover that much of the land. That's the blue covering the land. That was a prediction from a couple of years ago. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see the gray area right up here That's Ho Chi Minh City. So even the cities will get inundated, and the main rivers coming through. However, we did better satellite work, and now we're over here, and you'll see the same area of Vietnam. And now they're saying we got better data, and we think now once a year by 2050, there'll be high tides that will cover this much of Vietnam. And a staggering thing to see, because up here is the border with Cambodia. So basically, the width of the country will be underwater once a year from high tides as sea levels rise. Vietnam has 99 million people as of this morning, a huge difficulty. We're shifting from oceans to land now and fresh water problems. We know that 70% of the planet is underwater. About 0.03% is accessible and drinkable, even though it looks like there's lots of water, not for us. We know that when we use it, it does other things. We use it to raise cattle, for example. It takes 3 million gallons, American gallons, to raise a cow from a tiny calf to a beef steer before you get it in your McDonald's Big Mac. And it takes another 4,000 gallons to make the burger, between moving the animals, feeding the animals, cleaning the animals, killing the animals, and cleaning up and moving them around. And it takes about 3,000 gallons of water to grow cotton for a pair of jeans. Cotton is a very water-intensive crop. You can see where this is headed, and by 2030, which is only 6 years from now, about half the planet could be facing water scarcity. I don't have to emphasize that too much if you're in parts of the world now that are already facing water scarcity. I think Zambia and Zimbabwe and perhaps even Kenya are good examples of the difficulties right now. In the middle of all this, our Pope Francis issued a warning about care for our common home. You can see the date, 2015. That was the same year that the SDGs were endorsed by the General Assembly of the United Nations. No small thing. So in 2015, we got these two important documents. Francis was at pains to make sure that everybody understood this is not just about the animals and the plants. We have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. You can hear that argument already. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's Laudato Si, paragraph 49. Cry of the earth, cry of the poor. He's worked on this question for a long time. He's also made it clear that the economy has to be set right. He's reflected on the fact that reality is often comprised of opposing forces, big and small, grace and freedom, justice and love. Well, we've got to do better. Here's an example. This is a photograph of Sao Paulo, Brazil. You can see on the right-hand side of the photograph the luxury apartment tower with balconies on every floor, and even some of the balconies have pools, tennis courts, etc., the swimming pool. And just over the little fence there is the slum where the poor have to exist, the favela, as they call it. There's a terribly marked contrast and a good example of what does inequality look like that the Pope is concerned about. This is probably the world's most expensive private yacht. Just to make the point, 8 men own half the world's wealth. So they have as much money as as we say, the bottom 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity. And sadly, the photograph shows what they spend their money on. Meanwhile, for many people, the bottom half, daily existence is a struggle, and a struggle. A picture of a communal well in India, must be 100 people in that photograph, all with their small water containers, and then you can see they have to wait their turn to let down their buckets into the local well. So Francis talks about building a civilization of love. Avante, avante, says Francis, go forward, go forward. He's made it clear, and this is from Laudato, the poor suffer first from all of these things. They suffer first from climate change, as we have seen. Sea level rise, we just talked about that. Severe weather, we've seen those photographs. The drought, we've seen pictures of that. Desertification and deforestation, we've seen those images. Also, we have to be concerned about the privatization of water, because we know as the water scarcity increases, many forces will assemble to collect resources such as water and take it private and maybe make it more difficult to secure. That's going to increase food insecurity. We saw that with the floods in Pakistan. We also know that in Brazil in particular, there's a tremendous amount of land grabbing and toxic dumping from mining interests. We'll say more about that in a few minutes. So the extractive industries, the mining, the logging, the drilling, all damaging, particularly to indigenous lands, and then species extinction. We talked about the biodiversity diminishment. Food and fisheries are also being impacted. So all of these have an out of proportion influence on poor people, partly because there are so many poor people, and partly because they're so often underrepresented in government. So now we're forward. We're in 2023. Just a few months ago, Francis had to get back up and, so to speak, and shout louder. And he issued an exhortation called Laudate Deum, not the same as an encyclical, but much more urgent. So we had Laudato Si, praise to you, Lord, and it was on Care for Our Common Home. That was 8 years ago. And then just a few months ago, Laudate Deum, praise God. And in this document, Francis was much more urgent. And here's what the main point is. He's saying, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. Clearly, he's in distress here. The world in which we live is collapsing and maybe nearing the breaking point. Those are pretty strong words for a pope at any time, and certainly for this Holy Father, who was very pastoral, but now he's basically scolding us, saying we've got to do better. So the comparison here, Laudato Si was a gentle pastoral call to conversion, addressed all people living today. That was in 2015, around the same time as the SDGs. And then Laudate Deum is a visceral, prophetic call to conversion, addresses people of goodwill, admonishing the human family. That's us, that has neglected its relationship with creation, with one another, and above all, with God. Those are the two strongest documents we have from Francis about this situation. He's saying climate change is undeniable. Its effects are becoming evident, despite some attempts to minimize or ridicule them. And sadly, even some of our hierarchy have been in that category of minimizing the threat. And then he regrets the main cause of the problem is human activity. And as that we cannot correct such damage, we can still take steps to prevent more serious damage in the future. A little quick survey from COP21, the Conference of the Parties, that's about the climate problem. And number 21 was in Paris, that was 2015. Then we jumped. 27 was in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh. 28 was in Dubai, just last year. 29 is coming up in November in Baku, another petrol state, and COP30, Belém do Pará in Brazil. You can see they move them around the planet, but we still have the same problem. 30 COPs, and we still haven't addressed this sufficiently. We know we have the Sustainable Development Goals. We know how crucial they are. This is a breakout of those goals in terms of 3 places. The biosphere at the bottom, you can see the land, the water and sanitation and climate, all supporting everything. And then the second level up, society, where we get education and we get institutions and we get healthcare and gender equity and ending hunger. And then the top level, the society level, about jobs and careful consumption and production, and also human rights. And at the very top, at the top, we talk about partnerships for the goals. It's another way to imagine what they look like in terms of conversation. And then we know, as we go forward, that we've got climate action. This is the goal 13. Just want to take you quickly through a goal and what the pieces are. So we'll go to goal 13 and say, that's the goal. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. So we have that in front of us. And what we'll do is, I think it's a good idea if we take a break now, just to let you know that the goals were dragged out, so to speak, by 3 years of negotiations. And when we got to goal 13, we were pretty tired, but we did at least go to the trouble of breaking them down. So notice now the language is different. It's not a goal now, it's a target. So it's goal 13, target 13.2. Pardon me, integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. You can see how they've gotten a little more granular here. Okay, that's a great goal. Address climate change. So what does it mean? How do we find that target, so to speak? Well, they made targets to look for. So we're going to aim to integrate the climate change measures into the national policies. You can see now why each country is going to have to be responsible for what they might do in terms of response. So that's the beginning of the target listings. Then you go past the targets, you get down to indicators, even more small scale. But let's see. So they want to look at the number of countries with nationally determined contributions. If you see the initials NDC, nationally determined contributions, that's what that refers to. A lot of times at the UN, it's all acronyms. So NDC is what the countries said when they went home. Remember that's the thermometer from the beginning of the show? The blue line on the thermometer, that was what they said they would do. That's the NDC section. Long-term strategies, we got to have those. National adaptation plans are very important, and adaptation communications. So they have to report back to the UN. So that's an indicator that a country is making some progress on goal 13. Also, they have to track their total greenhouse gas emissions every year. Other indicators, sorry to say, you have to count who's dying, who's missing, especially after a disaster. Then the number of countries that adopt and implement national disaster risk strategies in line with the Sendai. The Sendai framework is a UN project. I believe it's because it took place in the city of Sendai. That's why they call it that. But it's a way to work out of a disaster, and it's been in place since 2015. Another indicator, 13.3.1. What extent are the global citizenship education events happening, and the education for sustainable development have to be mainstreamed, and national education policies, curricula, teacher ed, student assessment. All of these things are about climate and the climate goal of ending climate change. So it has to get into everybody's school system. And people who are no longer in school need to be educated. Awareness raising, human and institutional capacity on climate mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, early warning. All of these things are part of indicators for achieving goal 13. People may have this question. How is my country doing on the SDGs? You can find out, and maybe some of you have to because you may be in that kind of work. So this is a country profile. This is a link. It's in the slides. You can always go back to it. But basically, you can see what happens here. You can get this. This is the Sustainable Development Report. It's an easy document to look up on the internet, and you can see, you can search by country. Each country has its report card available on the net, and you can go find your country, click on the flag, and say, let's see how we're doing. So it's not that difficult to find out how your country is doing on these questions. This is what the report looks like. And again, the profiles are there for your enjoyment. It's produced by Sustainable Solutions Development Network. It's a very good operation. It's been around for a couple of years, and they do a report every year. The most recent one there is on the screen from 2023. This summer, there's a high-level political forum on sustainable development taking place at the UN. We're looking at a number of countries. Our brother Tino is coming over to New York to check that homework. This is a photograph of outside the UN in New York at the headquarters. You can see they have these graphics lined up in the courtyard with smiling faces telling us we're working on these goals. Let's keep at it. And we'll have a much larger conversation about it during the summer in July. They're focusing on these 5 goals for this summer. There's 17 goals, of course, so we can't do every goal every summer. So there's 5 goals, and I think, Tino, something around 40 plus countries who will be reporting this summer to see what's happened. And they'll, at the end of that session, they'll have some high-level, as we say, ministers, that is, ministers or heads of state, will be in New York to speak about what their countries are doing. So that's how they broke it out. You can see they're going to look at poverty, they're going to look at hunger this summer, particularly those 2 goals. And then climate action, as we just went down that list, they're going to take a look at that. And then 16 and 17, which were the kind of last 2 goals we worked on in the meetings we had, peace and justice and strong institutions, because the delegates assembled said, we have wonderful goals. We have all 15 of these goals, but how do we make sure they happen? And the answer was, we need to get strong institutions. So that's why you have the dove holding the olive branch for peace, and then the justice gavel for courts and institutions that will support this effort. And then finally, the last part, how are we going to pay for this? They said we need partners. So that's what 17 is, the partnerships for the goals. Pope Francis, we've said, has talked about inequality, and a just distribution of the fruits of the earth and human labor is not philanthropy. It's a moral obligation. And he's speaking, of course, to the Christian family, the Catholic family. Responsibility is even greater. It is a commandment. And it is about giving to the poor and to peoples what is theirs by right. This is an important argument here. The universal destination of goods. You may not have heard that phrase before, but the universal destination of goods is not a figure of speech found in the church's social teaching. It is a reality prior to private property. That's where Francis really annoys people, particularly in the United States, making the universal destination of goods more important than private property. He goes on, property, especially when it affects natural resources, must always serve the needs of peoples. He gave this speech at the World Meeting of Popular Movements. I think it was might have been in Brazil or Colombia a couple of years ago. So it's not in a document around, but I thought the quote was helpful, that private property is not the goal of everybody. The universal destination of goods must be the goal. And I talk about private property. I refer you back to the image of the world's most expensive yacht and the 8 men who own half the resources of the planet. Now, related to that, another publication of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network is called Global Commons Stewardship Index. Now, you see, that's pretty recent, 2024. They're talking about transforming global production and consumption for Earth's safe operating space. I need to make sure you understand that there are people working on this problem. Good people, science people, they're not necessarily religious people, but they certainly have in mind the goals that Francis has put forward in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum. And I recommend these particular documents and their thinking, because sometimes you feel overwhelmed. You say, well, what can we do? Well, here's some answers. You can start paying attention. And this is the Global Commons Stewardship Index. They point out some real danger points. So they're not, pretending everything's fine. They're just saying we have a way to go forward. And they make the connection that unless the SDGs are pursued, geophysical tipping points combined with technological disruptions could ignite disastrous social conflicts within and between nations. Now, I don't have to tell anybody on this call that there are already awful conflicts between nations that have erupted into major conflicts around the planet. So this set of people is saying we have to be pushing the SDGs. We must therefore acknowledge the real risk of negative social tipping points, beyond which peaceful governance and coexistence breaks down, as it did in World War I and World War too. So they're very clear-eyed about the threat. And they go on to list, we firmly believe that the international cooperation, together with the achievements of the SDGs, is the best preventative for this dire and growing risk. So anybody who's working on the SDGs, don't stop. That's a good formula for going forward. They represent an opportunity to create positive social tipping points. For example, through equal access to high quality education, SDG 4, and by fighting all forms of inequalities, including income and wealth inequalities, SDG 10. So educate people and fight those inequalities in SDG 10. One tiny bright spot, I don't have it on the slide, is that we did do a survey this year and found that globally, literacy has gone up significantly. So more and more people are learning how to read. So that's a good sign that SDG 4 can have an impact. Again, the global commons talk about human activities threaten stability and resilience. We need the resilience because we're going to be hit with terrible events here. And then the interdependent Earth systems. Notice the word interdependent. Everything is connected to everything else. And these provide the foundation for humanity's prosperity and future well-being. Everything is connected. Here's 3 points that they make. They say global production and consumption. Remember that was, I think, goal 12. Those systems continue to undermine the stable and resilient Earth systems, global commons, which are the foundations of our civilization. The environmental stress caused and transmitted through trade systems is significant, often exceeding 30% of the country's total GHG emissions. So your country is doing a lot of trading with other countries, but it's pushing out more and more greenhouse gases. And 50% of the country's total impact on, you saw that, deforestation, water stress. We have to get better at watching how we do these things. And third, the world currently does not have a global governance mechanism to coherently address spillover impacts associated with unsustainable global supply chains. Nobody's in charge, basically. People do what they want, and terribly, mostly corporations do what they want. We had a terrible accident here in this country not too many weeks ago. A large container ship crashed into a bridge in Baltimore and knocked the whole bridge down. Almost a 2-mile-long bridge came down in 10 seconds. Turns out that the container ship was not well maintained. They were cutting corners on maintenance. Container ship wasn't really performing well, lost power, and drifted. And they couldn't get it back in time and steer it, and it crashed into the bridge. So that was an impact associated with the unsustainable global supply chain. They weren't taking care of things, and they rushed it to save money. And look what happened. Now, another angle on this, Tino referenced earlier the special rapporteurs, the special procedures, all those other UN mechanisms. So I'll just pull one. This is the 2022 report on the SDGs, Tendai Achume. She's the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Much longer title. I just put it up there as racism, discrimination, and intolerance. Noted that the racism and racial discrimination are key barriers to sustainable development. The SDGs held untapped potential to advance both development and non-discrimination. So everything is connected. You can see it. The report's recommendations include calling for more racially disaggregated SDG indicators. Now, we went through some of those indicators for climate. I didn't see any call for racially disaggregated SDG indicators specifically, but I did see they were trying to track people who gets killed in disasters, and they have to keep track of that. And that's going to be, sadly, it's going to show us a racial component. Also looking for dialogue with stakeholders and how to use these indicators to better allocate resources. So even when we look at racism and intolerance, we're seeing SDGs potential for making a difference. We do have signs of progress. I'm going way, way back now. This is 10 years ago. Greta's story. There's a link there on the slide if you want to go look at that. You can see little Greta sitting on the steps of the parliament in Sweden with her little sign and her yellow slicker. That was it. That's how all that started. Became Fridays for Future. It's still happening. Poor Greta is still getting arrested because she's saying governments are not doing enough about climate change. And it was a lonely vigil at the beginning. Since then, I have a good sampling here of other people. Now, notice these other people are all young women. I'm not sure how to interpret that. But woman, Vasini Prakash in the left-hand corner, who I believe is from India, then Sage Lanier in the middle at the top, who's an American from California. Radhima Pandey from India. If you watched the film The Letter, you may remember Radhima. She was the little girl from India who got a letter from Pope Francis. Left-hand corner, Ayesha Sadiq, I believe she is from Pakistan. Vanessa Nakata from Uganda. And at the bottom in the right, Bastida, she is American, but Mexican heritage. All young women in their 20s who are working on the climate question, all inspired, I believe, by Greta's actions. So let's not give up. There's wonderful young people out there. And there's a little more about Medina. She began this work many years ago. She started a complaint accusing states of violating the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was an interesting direction to go, and failing to address the climate crisis. I think she started when she was about 9 years old. So good for her. Don't be shy. One of the things that does happen is we start to see some changes. Here's a picture there of a wind turbine, an onshore wind turbine. These are answers to some of our greenhouse gas problems. As you saw, like the first or second slide, we're burning too much fossil fuel. A way out of that is to produce these kinds of technological solutions. You can just see the immensity of these things by the figures on the bottom. Massive projects to put these up there, but we need to go in that direction. This is a photograph of a vessel in the North Sea. You can see the green bottom of that boat. That's a boat. And the orange smokestack top things. Those are the kind of the caissons. The boat sails along, and then when it's at the spot that has to work, it drives those things into the sea and then lifts itself up so it can work the crane. So a massive amount of technology is involved in this kind of work. The encouraging thing is it's happening. There are people working on it. And even in the back of the picture, way back, just barely, you can see a rainbow. So yes, things are going in a good direction, at least up in that part of the world. We know also about solar panels, which I'm sure many of you have seen and understand. This is a response to everything. This is the comprehensive plan to reverse global warming. About 3 years ago, maybe longer. And it has 100 solutions, 100 of the best solutions. And for each solution, they show its history, the carbon impact, and the cost and savings, and the path to adoption, and how it works. I keep pushing this out there. This is a terrific resource, and it's now, you can probably just jump on the internet and find it. Again, to encourage you, and maybe even to give you some ideas about how we might address these questions. We have other things happening. There's a little picture of Earth Day kids in Amritsar in India last year. This is at the World Social Forum. I think that was in Africa not too long ago. And you can see the Oxfam poster there held up by that young man. Poorest countries are taking out loans to respond to a climate crisis that they didn't make, which has always been the case. So how do we address this? Well, here's one person who's made a very deep impact for many of us on this question. Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados. She was recently elected. This is a picture of her at the COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago. And she was speaking, you can't see them, but in front of her in that audience are heads of state, including the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of France, the President of the United States. They're all sitting down there in front of her, and she's lecturing them, scolding them, because she knows that they know what she's going to tell them. And she's saying, we have the money. This is Mia Mottley. And here's the solution, because they were complaining they had to do this loss and damage fund, and oh, where we're going to get the money? It's too much money, way too much money. And she said, here's what you do. You put a 1% tax on fossil fuels and put that money in the loss and damage fund for poor nations. That's it. She said, there's the solution. And now she was a finance minister, so she's basically standing up in front of them, and she's, in a sense, as we say in the old days, she's got the receipts. She knows you can do this. And if they did that, 1% tax in 1 year, they collect $70 billion on a 1% tax on fossil fuels. So yes, this is doable. We know there's money. It's just willpower. In the US, we're doing some advocacy work now with our President Biden, who's actually been pretty good about climate, but not enough. And so we just had the hottest 10 years. We had the hottest 1 year. We're going to have another record this summer. This is USA. Sorry, we're focusing here. We're going to have more hurricanes, etc. So we said to the president, please declare a climate change national emergency under the National Emergency Act, advance the end of fossil fuels, redirect all agency funds toward renewable energy and away from fossil fuels, build back fossil free, and then establish high labor standards to protect workers against extreme heat, wildfire smoke, and other climate emergencies. Even now, the people who pick the crops don't get enough water breaks. And the companies that are running these operations say, well, we can't give them too many breaks because we'll lose money. So it's a horrendous example of inhumanity. One piece that we didn't get to yet, and I think it's important, is the plastics treaty. It's happening right now while we're on this call. There are people in Canada meeting about a plastics treaty for the planet. Why is that important? Well, here's as we say, the data point. We put, since the 50s, more than 8.3 billion tons of plastic out in the atmosphere. 9% of it has been recycled. So even though you might be very diligent about recycling, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of what's been going on. And a lot of it doesn't really get recycled. You put it in the bin and who knows where it goes. But that's what we have to work with. The rest of it's either burned or lands up in landfills in the natural world. It lands up in the ocean. And they're telling us at the current rate of plastic production and disposal, oceans are on track to contain more plastic than fish as soon as 2050. Background, there's 3 slides on this. The background for this now is slide 2 here. Plastic use has quadrupled. 380 million tons are put out there annually. Microplastics are the little tiny bits, they're tiny, 5 millimeters. They're created to make other things or the result of plastic breaking down. When stuff goes into the ocean, it just floats around, but it does get broken down gradually into these tiny pieces. And now, we call microplastics. They're found virtually everywhere on Earth, from the deepest parts of the ocean to the highest mountains. They're in the air and in the water. These are awful things. This is slide 3 here. Heavy metals and environmental contaminants can stick to microplastics, which bioaccumulate in the tissues of animals that ingest them. So the fish eat the tiny plastic, they think it's food. The birds eat it, they think it's food. Bottled water, seafood, dust, even fruits and vegetables contain microplastics. And all of us ingest about 50,000 to 120,000 pieces every year. That's creepy to know that, but that's what they're finding out. Microplastics have been found in human blood, lungs, kidneys, and placentas. Yes, in the placenta of moms who are having babies. Microplastics. This is a sculpture put outside the negotiating hall. It was in Nairobi for a while. I think it's gone off to, it's probably out there outside the hall in Ottawa this week. A never-ending faucet of plastic. That's our current challenge. Background 4, they just take one. For example, the single-use plastic water bottles. 1 million of these are purchased every minute. That's right, 1 million a minute. What happens to this plastic? When we fail to dispose of it safely, it ends in natural environments. How do they change? Do they ever truly decompose? They're reminder that this fourth round of negotiations is happening right now. Started on Tuesday. We'll see what goes into that. By the way, the UN, for many years, even during the negotiations on sustainable development goals, would put bottles of water on the tables for the delegates in plastic from Fiji. It was awful. And eventually people copped onto it and said, no, this is craziness. We can't do this. So now even the UN has caught on and they don't have any more plastic water bottles in the conference rooms. Sadly, it's still offered in the gift shop. It's a different set of people, but it took a long time for even the UN to wake up and say, we can't be doing this. So good for us. There's a report they put out just recently that hazards to health, 4,200 chemicals, plastic, because 4,200 plastic chemicals are considered hazardous. About 400, what you call chemicals of concern, can be present in each major plastic type, food packaging and plastics that leach hazardous chemicals. For making plastic safer, novel approaches to regulate plastic chemicals are needed, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see, this is from a Plastchem report from Trondheim in Norway. There's a photograph of the Nairobi conversation. That was last November. And now we're in Ottawa, and Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee develop an international binding plastic pollution treaty. So that's big language for what the UN is trying to do. First three sessions, they had people from about 175 countries, along with industry representatives. I emphasize that point. We had a lot of issues during the COP in Dubai because so many oil companies were there. Well, the same thing is happening now in the plastics treaty negotiations. A lot of industry people are there, sadly. There's a high ambition coalition. They want to end plastic pollution by 2040. And then there's a global coalition for plastic sustainability. Those are, weasel words. And you can see who's in that group. The fossil fuel crowd. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, Cuba, China, Bahrain. They say we want to counterbalance. We don't want to go too far advanced in this high ambition crowd. So we'll see. They want to focus on addressing plastic waste. So that's the awful news now, is the chemical industry is pretending that recycling works. And they're going to try to convince us, oh, we'll take care of it. And you may even have seen their commercials. Certainly in America, we've seen commercials on television now saying, isn't plastic wonderful? Look at all the things we can do. And we're getting really good at changing the way we use plastic and recycling it and making it even better. So you can always depend on plastic. And it's the American Chemical Council. Partly because the fossil fuel industry knows they're going to have to get out of fossil fuels. And they also know plastic is a product of fossil fuels. So it's a way forward for the fossil fuel industry to pivot to plastic. Sad to say, it's working. There's a link again that'll be on the slides if you want it, about what's going on in the plastic treaty. I really pushed this. I know Tino wasn't expecting me to do a whole thing on plastic, but I think it's a crucial ingredient. It gets lost. I don't know that Francis mentions it too much in his talks and his encyclicals, but it's a real issue, and it's certainly impacting the planet. The Laudate Deum thing was explicit. It was urgent. He talked about faster action. This is the new Laudate Deum from Pope Francis. This is the one from just last year. Point-by-point rebuttals of climate denial, climate complacency, corporate complicity, greenwashing. Remember Exxon for many years was talking about how we're going to convert algae into fossil fuel. Aren't we terrific? And then they ran the commercials for 2 years, and then they stopped doing that. So, and now they're saying they're really not going to phase out. They had a meeting in Houston about 3 weeks ago and said, never mind. We don't think that's a good idea. He attacks the technocratic worldview. He's defending climate protesters, so don't lose heart. If you're a climate protester, as many of us might be, you're filling a vacuum of global leadership. And he says they're calling out the ethical decadence of real power. That is, the people in charge are not out in the streets saying we should and the use of fossil fuels. It's the young people, mostly young people, saying we've got to stop this. How are we going to go forward? How are we going to live? So again, I post these at the end of any presentation that you can do things. You can see what's going on. You can make a judgment. You can take action. You can join a group, contact. If you're fortunate to live in a country with a legislature that responds, you can reach them. You can take public action. You can do civil protest. You can write to the editor of a paper. You can change your own practices. Keep learning, stay informed. These are all things any of us can do. Anybody on this call can do that stuff. My friend Thomas Berry, he's finished with a quote. The renewal of life on the planet must be based on the continuity between the human and the other than human as a single integral community. You notice that we didn't say much about, as we say, the non-human, but Thomas always made us think about it. There's a continuity between the human and the other than human. Once this continuity is recognized and accepted, then we will have fulfilled the basic condition that will enable the human to become more present to the earth in a mutually enhancing manner. He gave that talk a number of times. One time he even gave it at our own university. So yes, we have to pay attention. Very good. Thank you, Tino. Thank you, everybody, for paying attention, as we say. One of the things that struck me in the chat link, people were clearly somewhat surprised, I guess, by the emphasis on the plastics problem. And I'm sort of glad about that because I thought it had been neglected generally, and I have not been tracking the plastics treaty conversation for too long, but I was glad to see that it got some attention and some traction. I also noticed that it helps us to realize that even the UN, which is working hard on all of these questions, has been, I'm going to say the word infiltrated. Compromised? Not sure. At least in New York. I have a feeling that the Geneva UN Human Rights Council is much more alert to things, is, I think, pardon me, more wholesome about the world, and that what happens in Geneva at the Human Rights Council is really essential. And so far, it looks to me like it hasn't been really compromised by what's happening in New York, where a lot of corporations have made an impact on the conversations. It took us about 5 years of conversation to get the plastic water bottles out of the General Assembly. It really happened when one of the Assistant Secretary General, I think it was Johansson, I may not have gotten the name right. He came in one day and he sat down at the table at the front of the room, and he was leading this conversation. It was part of the SDGs conversation way back. This would have been 2012, maybe, so 12 years ago. And he had, in front of him, he had a glass of water, and he took a drink of water, and then he put it down. And he said, 2 billion of my brothers and sisters can't do what I just did. Drink a glass of water from a tap. And the room got very quiet. What is he talking about? He said, because we haven't paid attention to the care for the planet for water. And then he picks up, next to that, he picks up a plastic water bottle that was on the desk. It was, you could see them on every desk. They had a bottle of plastic water, bottle of plastic filled with water. And he looked at the label. He said, this is from Fiji. He said, I'm in New York. This had to come through the Panama Canal. This is crazy. To take water from the Pacific island, bottle it, put it on a ship, and bring it across the Pacific Ocean, through the Panama Canal, up to New York, so I can have this on my desk. That is crazy. So he put it down now. That was the first time I saw somebody in that high level. He was an Assistant Secretary General. Speak that forcefully about something like that. And I think it really made a difference. So in that case, it was kind of reverse. It wasn't people in the streets. It was actually somebody in a good position. But he knew about that because he had been paying attention. So you can influence people and you can make a difference. Right now, the other example is in a sense, the other side of the equation is Greta sitting by herself on the steps of Parliament with her little yellow rain slicker. And she had convinced her parents that this is a horrible crisis and we have to do something. And of course, she's a kid in high school. They said, well, what can you do? And she said, I'm going to protest. And she rode her bicycle down to this Parliament. She was not that far away, and sat on the steps. In the first couple of days, she was ignored. And then the police came and told her, you don't have a permit. Of course she didn't have a permit. She's a little kid. So they moved her, but she was smart enough to put that move on Facebook and say, look what they're doing. And that ignited her friends who said, this is wrong. And that became Fridays for Future. And they're still marching on Fridays all over the planet. So it's not something that you necessarily know how it's going to turn out in advance. I'm sure that Ambassador Johansson didn't know where his comment would go. And I'm sure Greta was only hoping that something would change. So I encourage you, if you think of something and you want to say, I think this will work, well, it may not, but you need to try. The last comment I'll make about the chat things, yes, I think we're all paying attention. I think part of the reason is if you're on this call, you're already paying attention. You're giving up a chunk of your day to see what you might learn from us, and who pay a lot of attention to it all the time. So I would say, yes, that's encouraging to me to see the 60 or 70 people that are with us today. And I'd also say we need to pray for the good health of Pope Francis. He has been a huge champion. I'll tell you one other story. At those negotiations at the UN and the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council over a couple of years, do I have a time for one story, Tino?
Yes.
Okay. So we're in the meeting rooms, and we're the civil society, so we're upstairs like in a balcony, and it's toward the end of the time. This would have been starting in 2012, 2013, 2014. Now we're in 2015, and it's probably the spring, maybe around this time. And the chairs of the meeting were Macharia Kamau, who was the ambassador of Kenya, and David Donoghue, who was the ambassador of Ireland. They have co-chairs because the UN always tries to balance global South, global North. And Macharia had been there for the whole time, from 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. And David was a new recruit. The Hungarian man had left to go back to Hungary. So Macharia came into the meeting, Ambassador Kamau, and he sat down and he held up a book. Watch me now, I'm going to do this. And he held up a book, and I couldn't see it from where I was, but it was a copy of Laudato. And he's at the UN. And, two things you never do at the UN. You never tell a joke at the UN because nobody can get the translation right, because it has to go to 6 languages. So that's something you never hear as a joke. And another thing you never hear about is religion at the UN, because it's always a divisive issue. And here he is holding up a document written by a Catholic Pope. And he told the group, the whole meeting, he said, I've read this document. I've given a copy to everybody on my staff. I want everybody in this room to read it. It's the best document I've seen about what we're trying to do. And he looked over to the Holy See ambassador who was in the room. And he said, I want you to thank your Holy Father for this work. It's absolutely essential to what we're talking about here. And then he put the document down on the table, and then he looked at everybody and he said, and I'm not a Catholic, as if to underscore the point. This is for everybody. Well, we were up in the balcony, we're getting goosebumps, thinking, oh my goodness, this guy is really full on board with Laudato Si, and he's not a Catholic. But it was a good example of what's possible at the UN and what's possible in terms of international conversations. So I want to applaud Francis for that. And Macharia Kamau went back home a year or two later, so I haven't seen much of him later, but I know his effort there was very important and very helpful to us. So I say that to this group. You can never tell where your influence goes. So even Pope Francis, all the way, as we say, down to Greta, there's a nice continuum of people working on this and making these challenges. And I don't think we should be discouraged. I think we should be aware and maybe alarmed, but not discouraged. Tino, back to you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm adding Terry to the discussion over there. Terry?
Can you unmute? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So thank you, Kevin. I just noted a few of what was brought in the chat. Somebody spoke about all the R's. I think we should add to that rethink everything, redesign everything so that it is recyclable. That's a challenge to our industrial processes worldwide. Another thing about plastic and single-use plastic, if every institution went out of its way to ban single-use plastic, it would be amazing. Every school, every university, etc., around our world, it would send an incredible message. I can speak of my own country in South Africa, and I see public transport, these microbus taxis going along, and suddenly a plastic bottle is thrown out of the window. How do we make people aware of not polluting, not using single-use plastic wherever we are? And that's a great education I think we need to do. So something like that. I was very struck by what you said about what Pope Francis spoke about. Private property is not the ultimate goal for everyone, but the universal destinations of goods is the most important, Kevin. I think that was an incredible statement. How do we get back to a circular economy wherever we are, where we're not shipping goods around the world to feed our world? Now, interesting, you spoke about what happened in the United Nations. On Tuesday, Tino and I went into the UN in Geneva to a conference, a webinar, which was held by the Holy See in Geneva. The ambassador to the Holy See, the Archbishop, was there. The Food and Agricultural Organization, and the Geneva Environmental Group, and the United Nations Environmental Program. And their whole thing was about circular economy and the food industry around our world. Instead of having to ship things all around the world, how do we get to a circular economy in each town, in each city, etc., so that what we eat is produced locally, etc.? So a challenge would be, can you support your local market in your little town, wherever you are? So to buy local goods. It was amazing how they spoke to Laudato Si and Laudato Deum, Kevin, at this webinar on Tuesday. And the conference hall in the Palais, in the Palais Nations in Geneva, was packed with NGOs and states and embassies, etc., listening to this. Spoken openly about Laudato Si and Laudato Deum, quite incisive. So another thing we spoke about was the SR on racism, discrimination, and intolerance, how to get disaggregated data into how we implement the SDGs. I thought that was also insightful, Kevin. So that's something I would raise. Tino, sorry, if you've got anything else, Kevin, to add to all that, might be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, the three of us really would like to thank each one of you and all our participants who have joined us today, as well as on the other three Zoom training sessions. As Terry pointed out, you'll have, as well as Kevin over there, you'll have meet time. You'll have, yeah, all of you, including us, are busy people, and Zoom has just made life, you could say, more busy. But thank you for making the time. It just encourages us, as well as it shows, it tells each one of us that we are interested. We're interested in the rights of all people, human rights. We're interested especially in the rights of children, women, okay, and care of the earth. And we want to know how to advocate, and we would like to advocate. And so, as Kevin pointed out today, that is a starting point. And many of us, as Sister Marilla just pointed out, as well as Amarpreet, and as well as Arun just now, we are doing things, both in our own personal lives as well as in our institutions. And so please keep sharing those with us. We would love to hear some of those practical ways in which you are addressing issues at your own level or at an institutional level. Drop an email to me at ari.gaya@gmail.com. That's the common email that that you're already sending to me. So and if you do that by Saturday, I'll include it in the resources that I do send out next week.